Welcome to the first lecture about CSS. So just like we did in the HTML Fundamentals section, in this section we will also start by looking at what CSS actually is, and we will learn some common terminology so that you always know what I'm talking about when I refer to different pieces of the CSS code. So, first of all, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And just like HTML, CSS is also one of the core technologies of the web. Now, remember that we use HTML to basically describe the content of a page. And on the other hand, we use CSS to describe the visual style and the presentation of the content that we previously wrote using HTML. So CSS and HTML work very closely together. And in fact, down here, you can see a web page, which is actually the project that we will build later in the course. So in the left side, you have just the content, so just the HTML. And then on the right side, you have the exact same HTML code, but with a lot of CSS. And so that CSS describes the visual style and also the layout, basically, of that whole content. Now, as you already know, HTML consists of a bunch of different elements that we can use to describe the content. And so, again, CSS is similar to that because CSS consists of countless properties that we developers can then use to format the content. And these properties allow us to format different things about the font, the text, the general spacing, the layout of the page, and so on and so forth. There is really lots of different properties, and of course you don't need to know all of them by heart. There's just no need for that. The way that you learn these properties is that you use the most important ones over and over again, and at one point it will then become very intuitive. Okay, so this is what CSS is all about. So let's now take a look at an actual piece of CSS code. So this is what a typical small piece of CSS might look like. And it always starts with a selector. So for example, if we want to style all the H1 elements on the page, we need to select it in CSS, and then we can apply some styles to it. And so each of these styles, we can call it a declaration. So for example, here we set the font size to 20 pixels. And so that font size is called the property, and the 20 pixels is the value that we declare for that font size property. And so property and value together is a declaration. And we can also more casually call that a style. Then all of these declarations or styles together make up the declaration block. So we have these curly braces after the selector, and so inside of the declaration block go all the different declarations, so all our styles. And all this together, so basically the selector plus the declaration block, is what we call a CSS rule. And so what this means is that in the end, our CSS code will be a lot of different CSS rules, one after another, where we select all of our elements and style them in any way that we want. Okay, and so that is exactly what we will start doing in the next video. So let's go there right now. There are three places where we can write CSS, and we call them inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. And so let's now learn about these three different types of CSS and also which one is the best. And in this section and also the next one, we will actually keep working on this same project that we started building in the last section. So the section about the introduction to HTML. And remember that this is how we left the project after that last section. And now by the end of this first CSS section, it will look like this. So that's completely different, right? So we have a lot of colors here. We have this color border at the top. The font is also completely different. So the text color also changed. And yeah, here we have some nice background colors. We even have this button here floating here on the right side. And so, yeah, a lot of visual styles are going to be applied through the page throughout this section. And you will learn a lot of CSS by building this project. Okay. Now, I like to keep one folder for each of these sections. And so I will now go to my desktop and create a brand new project folder for this section. So what I'm going to do is this time I will not go into this folder, which is the code that we downloaded from GitHub. But instead, what I will do is to simply copy this project from the last section. Okay. And then I will call it 03 and CSS Fundamentals. And so the starting point for this section is the final code of the last section. So I hope that makes sense. But if you feel like just working in the same folder, that is of course absolutely no problem. So you can just keep writing code exactly in the same documents that we have been working on in the last section. I'm just doing it like this so that in the end I can give you all the code organized nicely. Okay, so I will now close this window here, and we can right click, for example, here on VS Code and say new window, and then open the folder from here. So on the desktop, it is this that I just created. Open it, and then as always, I'm pushing it to the left side. Now, yeah, we can put this here on the other side, but later we will need a little bit more space, because you see that there was some space here before, right? And so with this layout just being on the right side, there is not enough for that. But for now, that doesn't really matter. Now this one that we had before, now since we closed that window, it will no longer work. So if I reload here now, Google Chrome tells me that the site can't be reached. So I can just close this, and I can then click again here on Go Live now in this new window. Okay, so in this new project, which is actually the same, but it is a new project folder, and so for VS Code, it is like a new project. So if I click now on Go Live, it should start again. And so here is the way we left the project after the last section, which is the starting point of this new one. Great. But now let's finally get started with some CSS, right? So remember, there were three ways of writing CSS, and the first one was inline CSS. So let me start by showing you how inline CSS works. And inline CSS is basically just writing the CSS code inside, essentially, of the element. So let's say that we wanted to style this text here blue, so this H1. We could declare the style attribute like this, and then inside of this HTML element and inside of this HTML file, we would then start writing our CSS. So we can say color and then set it to blue. If I give it a save, then you see that it turned actually blue. So this worked, right? However, inline styles should usually never be used. Okay, I'm just showing this to you so that if in some case you see this here on some other code and some other web page, then you know what it is. But you should not use it when you code on your own. So when you build your own web pages or websites, then don't do this, okay? And so let's now move on to the second way of writing CSS, which is called internal CSS. So with internal CSS, we come here to the head, and then we declare a style element. So style, and then we can write our CSS right here into this style element. So basically this entire page is HTML, but everything that is inside this style element that needs to be inside of the head will be CSS. And so now let's write something very similar to what we wrote by the end of the last video. So remember that we always need to start with a selector, because in this case we are not going to write the code directly on the H1 element. And so our CSS needs a way of knowing what element we actually want to style, right? So we can select it like this, and then we start our declaration block. And again, that is what we talked about by the end of the last lecture. And so now here we can write a style. So a declaration, which is just a property, in this case the color property, and then we specify the blue value for it. And if we now save it and reload, then you see that once again the code turned blue here. So this entire text just became blue. Great. So this is already a huge step forward, because now we decoupled the style, which is all of this here, from the actual HTML element. So before, as we had the style here, then the CSS and the HTML were kind of entangled. And that is never a good thing in programming. And so we want to keep these things in separate places. We also call it the separation of concerns. And so now we have our style here, so everything up in the head and the elements down here separated. However, if we have a lot of CSS code, then that is also not really practical. So imagine we have like 500 lines of CSS code, and that is actually not uncommon. And so in that case, that would bloat our HTML file, and it would be very hard to navigate it. And so therefore, we can separate things even more by putting all of our CSS code into a special CSS file. So let's do that. So we click here again on New File, and this one here can have any name, but I like to call it style.css. Okay, so in HTML, the first page should usually always be called index.html. That's really a convention. But for the CSS file, you can give it any name that you want. But again, I like to call it style.css. Okay, and so this is what we now call external CSS, because we will move now this declaration block, or this rule actually, into a completely different file. And so this CSS is now external to the HTML. Okay, so we have our style here, and now we no longer need the style in here. Now, maybe you noticed that as I saved this, the blue color is actually gone. So why do you think that is happening? So why is this text no longer blue, even though we have the exact same code here as we had before? Well, the reason is that HTML right now has no way of knowing that we actually do have a CSS file. Or in other words, the HTML file and the CSS file do not automatically get linked. So what we need to do is to tell our HTML file that there is a CSS file that we want to use to style the HTML. So we need to link them together basically, and we do that once again here in the HTML head, because that is exactly where all the information about the page goes. And for that, we use the link element. So that's yet another new element. And the link element is actually quite confusing for beginners, because many people, when they start out, might think that the link element is actually to create hyperlinks like here. But that is, of course, not the case. So as you know already, to create hyperlinks, we use the anchor tag, so not the link tag. So the link element really only has the only purpose of connecting the HTML to a CSS file. So here we specify href once again. And then here we need the path to the CSS file. And so in that case, this is just style.css. Then here it is also good to specify the rel property and tell the HTML ahead of time that this is a style sheet. And now when I save this again, watch what happens. And nice. Our text here is blue again. And so now we successfully connected our CSS file right here to our HTML file. So this is now external CSS, and it is what we will use throughout the rest of the course. And it's also what I advise you to do for whenever you build your own web pages. However, internal CSS also sometimes has its place, especially when you just want to build something small and fast and want to do everything in the same file. Then it is perfectly acceptable to create internal CSS using the style element. Remember? So just like this. But inline CSS, which is what I showed you in the very beginning, so adding the style right here using the style attribute, that is usually not a good practice. And so it's not a good idea to do that. All right. And with this now in place, we are ready to start learning our very first couple of CSS properties for styling text. And so that is going to be the subject of our next lecture. In this lecture, we will learn about 6 properties to style text with CSS. And let's just quickly recap what we did in the last lecture. So we are writing external CSS in this CSS file, and the CSS file is always composed of multiple CSS rules. So right now we only have one CSS rule, but of course we will now start adding more of them. Now a CSS rule always starts with a selector. So in this case we are selecting the H1 element. But if there were more H1 elements, then the selector would actually select all of them. Then we have this declaration block here, into which we can write one or more declarations like this one. And each declaration has this property name, so in this case the color, and then the value that we specify for that property, which in this case is this keyword of blue. Okay, and so now we will start adding some more properties here. And the first one that I want to use is the font size. So here we can basically specify the size of the text. And each property can take different types of values, such as length or keywords. So you see that here in the color, the value is a keyword. But now here in the font size, we actually need a length. So basically the size of the text in this case. Now we can specify length using different units in CSS, but don't worry about that for now. So for now we will simply use the very simplest one, which is pixels on your screen. So we can specify the font size, for example, to 26 pixels, then add a semicolon here. And so now the text on the screen will be exactly 26 pixels of your physical screen. So if I give this a save now, then you see that the text here decreased. And just remember that in case it didn't update on your computer and you are successfully connected to the live server, as you can see down here, then just manually reload the page here once, and then in the successful updates here of the code, it will then automatically reload your page. But anyway, let's now start adding the next property, which is the font family. And so here you can specify basically different fonts for your text. So just like you can specify a font in something like a Word document or a Google Page document, you can do the same in CSS. However, what's different in the case of CSS is that you cannot simply use a font family that you have installed on your computer, because that wouldn't then work for all the users that are going to visit your page in the future, unless they also have that font installed on the computer, right? So there is a solution for that we will talk about later, but for now we will simply not actually specify a real font family, but instead just use the keyword that we want the browser to use any font size that is a sans serif. And sans serif, we will also learn a little bit later what that actually means, so in the design section of this course. But if we give this now a save, you see that this font here changed completely, right? So now it looks more clean. But what matters is that now as we update our page, in fact, the font family here of this heading now looks very different, right? So it no longer has these serifs, which are like these small things here at the end of the letters. And again, later in the design section, we will then learn how we can specify specific font families for our pages. But now let's take a look at our next property here for text, which is text transform. And so with text transform, we can basically turn a text uppercase. So you can see one more time that VS Code gives us a lot of suggestions here. So this whole list, and so the most used one here is actually uppercase. So uppercase like this, and the result is exactly what you would expect. So all the text simply turned uppercase. So this is a simple one. And now let's try another one, which is called font style. And here again, you see these options. And the most used one in this case is to set some text to italic. So let's check that out. And indeed, that is just what happened. So the text turned italic as expected. Great. So we already covered 4 properties and some of its possible values here. So we're making good progress. And of course, as I mentioned before, you do not have to start memorizing these properties here now. You will get used to them over time as you start using them more and more. And let's actually get rid of this one here, because we will actually talk about colors a little bit later. Okay. So let's now go to our next headings. So let's now style our H2 element. So that is this basically main heading of this article. And so we can use the properties that we already learned. And so if you keep typing these property names, they will start getting into your brain. So this one, let's actually make it even bigger than the H1. So really big, like 40 pixels, and that's no problem at all. So just because the H1 is the main heading of the page, it doesn't mean that it also needs to be the biggest one. So being the H1 is really all about semantics, not only about what it looks like. So we have a nice big text, and now let's just make it also a sans serif. So giving it this modern look and feel. So the sans serif keyword, and here we go. Next up, let's style our paragraphs. And so as I mentioned before, by selecting the P element like this, this will actually select all the P elements that are on our page. So this paragraph here, and this, and really all the ones that we have here on the page. Okay. So let's give it again a font size, let's say of 22 pixels. And for now, all of these length here, so all of these numbers that I've been using are kind of random. But later we will also learn how we can use a system so that we can basically automatically figure out which font sizes we should use. Okay, now I also want to change the font family again. And once again, using sans serif. And nice. That looks very nice already. And if we compare it with our demo, then we can see that we start getting closer to our demo page. So what we want to achieve in the end. There is actually just one more thing that I want to change here in the paragraphs, which is to specify yet another new property, which is the line height. So I will first actually specify it, and then you will see the difference in the text. So here we actually use a value without a unit. So in this case, this 1.5 simply means that the line height will be 1.5 times the font size. All right. So by default, the line height is simply 1. But now if we set it to 1.5, then you should see the space between the lines here increase. It's between here and here and here. So look closely at that as I now click here to reload the page. And you see that really changed. Right? And we could set it even higher, of course. And then we would get even more space. But that looks already a bit too much. So let's go back to 1.5 like this. Now, by the way, something quite interesting happened here that maybe you noticed. So remember how inside of these paragraphs that we just styled, we have different elements such as this italic text, which is an EM element, remember? So here in this paragraph, for example, we have the EM element, or here in this paragraph, we have the strong element, right? Or down here we have the anchor. So this element right here. And as you can see, these elements here on the page, so for example, this anchor here somehow got the same font size and the same font family as the P element, even though we did not specify these styles for the link anywhere. So we didn't specify the font size and the family and the line height, not for the anchor, not for strong text, or not for strong elements, and also not for the EM element, right? But still, they got these styles applied to them somehow, right? And the reason for this is a very important mechanism called inheritance. Now, this is a little bit complex to understand, and so we will have a whole lecture on inheritance a little bit later. But still, I wanted to already show you this effect in action here at this point. But anyway, let's now keep styling or reminding elements. So starting with H3, and let's put that here after the H2 to group our rules here in a logical way. So the font size in this one, let's make it like 30 pixels. So that's going to be this one here, exactly, and this one. So again, we have multiple H3 elements, and so by using the H3 selector here, we will select all of them. Now just the font family again, and setting it to sans serif. All right, and now finally we have the H4 heading. So that's this one here. So let's again set the font size and the font family. So 20 pixels. And here's sans serif. And actually, let's also turn the text uppercase here. So, and remember how we use the text transform property for that. We set it to uppercase like this. Nice. And now there is just one final property that I want to show you to basically style text, which is that we can also align text. So again, a little bit like we can do in Microsoft Word or in Google Pages or something like that. And so for that, we use the text align property. And again, you can see the options here. So one interesting one that we can use is to align the text to the center. And so guess what will happen now when I save it? Well, we need to go down here again. And you see that now it is in the center of the page. And technically it is in the center of its parent element, but that parent element basically occupies this entire page. And so therefore it is now at the center of the page. All right. And so now the only thing that we are missing is these list items here. So all of these 5 and these 3, and also these anchors. So the links. But we will style the links a little bit later because there are some special cases for links. So let's just finish this video by styling these li elements. All right, let's do that down here. And notice how we do not style the OL element and the UL element that are the parent elements of the list items. Okay, so remember that the list itself is an OL or it is a UL, but we do actually style the LI elements. Okay, and so again, let's set the font family to something. So to sans serif, actually. Give it a save. And we also want to change the font size one more time. So by default, we get this font size that we see here, which is usually 16 pixels by default. Okay, so that's an important thing that we also need to know a little bit later. So take note of that. But of course, we want to make it a little bit bigger. So we have our paragraphs at 22 pixels. So let's actually make this a little bit smaller. So let's say at 20 pixels. And that's it. Beautiful. So we finished the basic styling of our text of our page, and we learned about 6 new CSS properties along the way. So take some time to review what we just did, and then let's move on to the next lecture, where we will learn a little bit more about selectors. Let's now make the CSS code that we just wrote a little bit better by combining some of the selectors. So you might have noticed that we applied the exact same font family to all of our elements here, right? So all these 6 CSS rules that we have here, all of them have font style, or actually have font family set to sans serif, right? And you see that VS Code actually highlights these occurrences here in all of the rules. So doing that is a little bit repetitive, right? And it's also not a good practice, because let's say that all of a sudden we wanted to change the font family to something else. Then we would have to go through all of these different rules and set the font family then to something else there. So instead, what we can do is to create a list of selectors in order to select multiple elements and then apply this font family to that list, essentially. So let me show you how we can do that. And let's do it first here, actually. So what we want to do is to select the H1 element and the H2 element and the H3 element. And so, as you see, the way we write that is by using these commas. Okay. So again, here we are going to select the H1 elements and the H2 elements and the H3 elements and the H4 elements and the P's and also all the LI elements. Okay, and now we can grab this text here and cut it and paste it here. And now we can remove it from all of these other selectors. All right, and if I give it a save now, the page should basically look exactly the same. And it does. Okay, now prettier formatted or CSS code here like this. So having one element for each line. And so this is a bit easier to read. And so now if we wanted to change the font family, let's say to serif, which is actually the default. So if I save this now, then you see that all of the elements changed at once, right? So all of them now have the serif text. Then of course, if we set it back here, then all of them will change, right? So now we have serif text everywhere. Well, actually, except for in the footer. So that's something that we need to fix. And to make it easier here, let's actually simply wrap this text here inside a paragraph. So let's come here to our HTML. So this is really important that you do this. And so create a new element here, and it automatically closed it. So let's just then grab this text and paste it here. And you see that now this paragraph looks just like all the others. Okay, so don't skip this step. Please do this because we will now need it for another example. And in fact, let's look at that example right away. So the size of our paragraphs is 22 pixels. And so of course, now the paragraph that's in the footer, so this one, is also 22 pixels. However, the text that's in the footer is usually a lot smaller than the rest of the text, because this is just some secondary information that is not really important. And so therefore, we should actually make this text in this paragraph here smaller than the text in the other paragraphs. And one way in which we can do this is to combine selectors in another way. So just to recap, here we combined these 6 selectors into one list. So we say that the selector here is now a list selector. So this here is still one selector, but it is a list selector. Okay, so this is one way of combining selectors, but now I will give you another way of combining selectors. And the goal of that is, as we just discussed, to decrease the font size in here. So we will now use the so-called descendant selector, which is to write something like this. So we select the footer element, then a space, and then the P selector. And so what this will do is it will select all the P elements that are inside of footer elements. And so that's why this is called the descendant selector, because the P element is a child element of the footer in our HTML. And so therefore, this selector here will then select all of these paragraphs that are children of footer elements. And so if we now set the font size here to something smaller, let's say 16 pixels, then you see that all the other P's, they are still normal, but in fact, this paragraph that is inside the footer is now only 16 pixels small. And hopefully you can see how useful the descendant selector like this here is. So actually use this all the time. However, in this case, this actually isn't very robust, because like this, the selector basically reflects the HTML structure, which can lead to problems. And to show that to you, let's write another descendant selector. So in this case, let's say that we want to select this paragraph here that's inside of the header. So remember that we have a header here in the article. So this one here, and we have a P. So let's say we wanted to style that italic. So make the text italic. And so using what we just learned, we could say header, and then the P that is inside there, and then say font style and set it to italic. Okay, so this worked just fine. But now imagine that for some reason we also added a paragraph to this header element that is up here in the page. So let's try that. And remember that here we have another header, right? So as I was just saying, let's add a P here, test paragraph. And you see that this one is now also italic. However, what we wanted was only this paragraph here to be italic and not this one, right? So we need to solve this somehow, and actually we can solve it. It is not too hard. Well, at least in this case, because this header here is inside of the article and this one is not, right? And so we can actually create a nested descendant selector. So we can have a descendant inside a descendant. So what I mean is basically writing this. So we only want the paragraphs that are inside of headers, which are inside of articles, to be italic. So let's give it a save. And now only this one is italic and this one here not anymore. So this actually works, but we are now even more encoding the HTML structure into our CSS selectors. And that can make our code hard to maintain in the future if we ever change our HTML. And so that's not a good idea. So if we think about this, wouldn't it actually be a lot better if we had a way to basically give some elements names and then use these names to select them? Well, we actually can do that, and it is exactly the subject of the next lecture. So let's go there right now.